Would you consider maybe giving us a phenomenological run-through like you did with the ayahuasca or the DMT vision, relative to how this...
How it works with psilocybin? Well, when I take psilocybin, I take it on an empty stomach. I don't fast or anything like that. I just don't eat for 6 hours. I don't call that fasting. And then I take it in silent darkness. That's number one, very important. The next thing is weigh the dose. You must weigh the dose, because 5 grams is what you want. And I've had over and over the experience of showing somebody what 5 grams is, and they're appalled. They say, "My God, you can't be serious. I take a fifth that much, a fourth that much." Yeah, well, that's the problem. That's why you don't have elves in the attic and bats in the belfry like I do. And so then you take it, and I take it on an empty stomach, and a lot of people don't like the taste. I don't really understand that. I just chew them up. I sit with them, and I chew them up. And then, Dried. None of this mixing in applesauce or any of that malarkey. I mean, what's that about?
Well, I was just thinking versus fresh.
Oh, well, fresh, 60 grams. 60 grams. Because there's more than there's a huge water loss there. And then it takes, people sometimes say it came on within 5 minutes or it came on within 10 minutes. I don't know what that could possibly be about. First of all, it defies pharmacodynamics to imagine that it could come on that fast. For me, it comes on almost always at the 1 hour and 20 minute mark. I think it can come on sooner than that. I think I'm fairly resistant to these things. After I take it, I sit, I roll bombers, and I carry out what all good Catholics know as an examination of conscience. This means you think about all the bummers that you're afraid are going to jump out at you as soon as you get loaded. If you will carry out the examination of conscience, you'll be so bored with that by the time the compound actually hits that you usually don't have to pay any dues, because you've, faced the fact that you're a jerk 50 times in the preceding hour. So, and then the way I do it is at about the hour and 20 minute mark, and I should say in the time preceding that, you may have to go to the bathroom once. You may, it makes your nose run, which is a funny thing. It also makes you yawn. These are definitely qualities of psilocybin, not related to its psychoactivity. And I think that it's very good to decide before it hits that once it begins, you will not alter the plan. In other words, you decide ahead of time, I'm going to sit here and do this, because at about the hour and 15 minute mark, it will begin hitting you with stuff like, you'd really be more comfortable downstairs. Or, it's awfully hot in here. Why don't you get up and adjust the thermostat? All this stuff. You say, no. We're holding the space and sit there. And then it begins to come on. And the image I have is like a jellyfish or a silk scarf or something like that. It just kind of drifts down and surrounds you. And at that point, I guess I pray. I say to it, I'm completely in your hands. Please don't hurt me. I'm yours. I'm completely committed. I've held nothing back, so don't burn me, please. And then there is a kind of, it's hard to describe, a kind of potential begins to build up. and you say, the rush hasn't begun, but you can almost close your eyes and see millions of little psilocybin molecules elbowing serotonin molecules out of the way and fitting themselves into the receptor site, and the electron spin resonance dynamics is beginning to shift, and the whole thing is about to take off. At that point, I smoke furiously, and that usually is all it takes. And it comes on, and the first rush is really astonishing. I mean, sometimes it's more mind-boggling than others, but I can remember situations where I would just see it coming and say, oh my God, it's 100 miles wide and 10 miles high. Where are you going to run to? It's just, you say, good grief. I guess I'm not going to meet this one sitting up. I think I better lay down. And in about the time it takes to make and execute that decision, then it just hits. And it's like a tidal wave. I mean, I have the feeling when I'm doing it in California that everybody from Vancouver to Tijuana has just crawled under their desk, because you can't imagine this is happening between my ears. It's more like an asteroid must have fallen in the Pacific Ocean and raised some enormous incoming wave. It's sort of like. It's like watching a thermonuclear explosion through 50 feet of crystal clear glass. So, you're perfectly calm. It's not getting at you. But the energy that is being released in your presence is awesome. And then and sometimes in that first pass, the linguistic machinery is burned out. You've probably seen these scenes where they will test a hydrogen bomb, and they set up cameras a quarter mile from ground zero, a half mile, a mile, 2 miles, and then when they actually detonate the bomb, they get the view from the first camera, and then they switch to the second camera as the first camera is blown to bits and vaporized, and they keep pulling back as each successive instrument is destroyed. Well, this is sort of the feeling you have as this thing spreads out toward you. And then it does what it wants to do. It tells you what it wants to tell you, and it's highly unpredictable. I mean, people always say you should ask it a question. This seems absurd to me. I mean, I don't know. Once when my life was in turmoil, I did ask a question. I said, I wrote it down ahead of time, and the question was, am I doing the right thing with my life? And then when I got in there and I posed the question, and the answer came back instantly. It was a ripoff from Lyndon Johnson. It said, "What kind of a chicken shit question is that to ask me?" I said, "Oh, sorry, didn't mean to presume, Said, "Get your act together, and then we'll have a conversation. But if that's what you want to talk about, you should have taken MDMA." And and then, paralleling what we talked about this morning, and again, I'm just giving you my subjective take on it, it's like I come into a place. It's hard to describe. It's a feeling. And the content of the feeling is, now the elves are near. But they won't appear unless I invoke them. And, I wish I could tell you that I chant in Mandayan or something like that, but I don't. I stole a line from an old I Love Lucy program where Ethel is talking to Lucy about UFOs, and Lucy says she talks to the UFOs. And Ethel says, "Well, how can you talk to UFOs?" And Lucy said, "Well, it's simple. I just say, come in, little green men, come in, little green men, and that's what I do. I say, come in, little green men, and then there is, and women, if there are any out there, and then there is it's like a marching band. It's like a Nepalese marching band is what it's like. And it comes from a distance. Like there's a place in my vision that's small, a little dancing light and a little faint sound. And the light comes closer and the sound gets louder until finally, they pick me up on their shoulders and with tubas blaring and sackbut and rebeck and all of this stuff. And then they carry me around and talk to me. And the whole thing is shot through with such a weird sense of zaniness, Irishness, Joyceishness. I mean, it's almost unbearable. It's so... I don't know, not exactly Disney-esque, because their humor tends to be a little more savage than that. And then that is part of the first wave, and then the rest of the trip unfolds pretty much as there's a kind of a pushing and pulling that goes on. You can direct it. Each one of these plants does have a character of its own. One of the most puzzling things about these plants is that they have characters that seem irreducible. For instance, psilocybin, it is the science fiction drug. In other words, it says, we have been denizens of this planet for 400 million years. Our original home planet is in the M5-83C system. We are connected via hyperspace to all intelligent life forms in the galaxy. It shows you enormous machines in orbit around alien planets. It talks about the end of history and the collectivizing of humanity. And it's this enormous hortatory, salvational, dramatic, science fiction type scenario. Well, then you take ayahuasca, which in molecular terms is just a few nitrogens are moved around. I mean, it's basically the same thing. And you get a completely different message. You feel the energy of the rainforest and the rivers. And it's very feminine. You think about childbirth. You think about the continuity of generations. You think about the mystery of the meat. You think about tantric sexuality. It's all redirected back into the human and natural world in some way. And then, of course, DMT, which I described this morning, which the DMT elves are not from outer space, or they don't present themselves that way. In fact, one of the odd things about the DMT thing is that you have the feeling that this space that you break into, even though it's large, some people even refer to the dome of DMT. That tells you they really were there. But wherever this huge vaulted space is, you have the feeling, although it's hard to explain how you know this, but you have the feeling that you're way, way, way underground, which fits with the elf motif. You're in the hall of the Mountain King. You're under the hills with the little people who retreated under the hills. The character of these things is one of the most puzzling things about them. The logos seems more. First of all, it doesn't crack jokes and do quadruple entendre puns and stuff like that. It's more like a wise and loving teacher. These DMT things are, it's a troupe of maddened elves, and they are just doing their own thing. And then with ayahuasca, though some people claim they contact an entity, it hasn't been like that for me. It seems to me that on ayahuasca, you become like a camera you just fly through a visual world. I mean, after a good ayahuasca trip, you just feel like your eyes are bugging out of your head. I mean, it's like buying prints on Madison Avenue, you know, and you've just been looking and looking and looking, and you literally have to give your eyes a rest after an ayahuasca trip. And the ayahuasca visions are more, they seem to cover a broader spectrum. The psilocybin hallucinations tend toward this highly polished, machine-like, insect-like, outer space bit. And the ayahuasca hallucinations are wonderful pastels, laces, layering of colors. And then one of the most interesting things to me about ayahuasca, and I just cannot understand how this works. If I could, I'd be Erte or somebody. And that is that you, in the middle of the ayahuasca trip, you can suggest motifs. You can lead it so that, for instance, you can say to it, Art Deco. And suddenly there will be thousands of candy dishes, cigarette lighters, champagne buckets, automobiles, stained glass windows, doorknobs, silverware, all rolling in black space in front of you, all the perfect exemplification of this aesthetic, the Art Deco aesthetic. And then you can say to it, okay, Italian Baroque. And it just like that, suddenly altarpieces, Madonnas, martyred saints, and fantastic scroll work and fleur-de-lis. And you can say, well, surprise me. And then you will get a coherent style, like Art Deco, like Italian Baroque, except that nobody's ever bothered to realize it on this planet. But it's as coherent. It's like, 20 years ago there was no such thing as Southwest as a style. This weird thing coming out of Santa Fe that I notice has planted its roots deep here as well. The turquoise and beige endlessness of feathers and hammered titanium and all that. Well, that's an aesthetic that has cohered in the last 20 years and come into being. There seem to be an infinite number of these things, as different as the bronzes of the Han Dynasty are to a Dali or a Pollock or a Bosch. And then you can say to it, going beyond the surprise me challenge, is what I always say to it is, I want to see more of what you are for yourself. And then it's like there's this low organ tone, and it begins to lift the veils, and the temperature in the room drops about 20 degrees. And after about 20 seconds of that, you just say, enough of how you are for yourself. Because you can tell what's happening is it's starting to reveal something so peculiar and so untailored for the human mind or eye that you become afraid. You say, can we go back to dancing mice, Art Deco cigarette lighters, and Baroque altarpieces, please? This is turning into deep water as far as I'm concerned. Yes.
What happens on higher than, if anything, higher than 5 grams of mushrooms?
How can you go? 10 grams, 20?
Oh, that's a good question. Good question. It requires a small detour into pharmacology. The concept, which all pharmacologists are familiar with, and which you should be too if you're going to deal in this realm, called LD50. This is not a pretty notion, but a necessary one. It stands for lethal dose 50. What does this mean? It means if we have 100 mice, how much psilocybin do we have to give each mouse to kill half of them? Do you see? LD50. half the sample dies at the LD50 dose level, whether it's graduate students or rats. Now, when you're designing a drug, or when you're thinking about a drug, what you want is a drug with an extremely high LD50 opposed to its effective dose. So say the effective dose of psilocybin is probably about 0.5 milligrams per kilogram. And the LD50 is probably 200 milligrams per kilogram. The LD50 of psilocybin is 400 times the effective dose. This is a pharmacologist's way of saying this is very, very safe.
So if you eat a pound, you're probably going to die.
A pound wouldn't kill you. I don't think. It might be getting close, but you'd have to eat in that range to die. Now, some drugs have horrendous LD50 to effective dose profiles. Unfortunately, and I hope I don't rain on anybody's parade here, MDMA has a terrible LD50 profile. The effective dose is 125 milligrams. You can kill yourself with 1,000 milligrams. So that's not good at all, because sure as hell some street person or some depressed person or some maniac is going to take 1,000 milligrams, and then you've got a stiff on your hands. So I don't want to trash MDMA. It's changed a lot of people's lives and saved relationships and so forth and so on. But to me, it's a perfect example of why you're better off taking plants. Because here was this drug, somebody invented it, they gave it to a few friends, it seemed to be wonderful for solving personal problems. So without any collection of human data, this thing becomes an item in the underground. Well, and so then thousands of people take it. The psychological effects seem completely benign. It's a wonderful thing. The physiological effects, it's a very disturbing profile. It's not that it destroys the serotonin receptor site, it's that neurons are covered by these very delicate structures called dendritic spines. Now, nobody knows what dendritic spines do, but every neuron in your body has them. And when you take MDMA, it mows them down. They go away. Now, so then you get two schools of thought. One says, well, my God, anything impacting the physical brain that dramatically should be stayed away from. And the other camp says, well, do you see any behavioral changes in people who take MDMA a lot? Do you see any physical destruction, seizures, blindness, anything? And the answer is no. So they say, well, here we have histological evidence that this thing is making major physiological changes in the dendrites and no behavioral sequela to back up that this is of any consequence. Well, my position, being basically a very conservative person, is in that case, wait. You know, they're doing work on this in a dozen labs around the country. They'll figure it out. In the meantime, take psilocybin or mescaline or something else that has been sanctioned, because you just do not want to insult the physical brain. You know, that's the whole name of the game. You have to keep the brain in good shape. So, taking a compound like psilocybin, if the effective dose is 20 milligrams for somebody who weighs 135 pounds. Well, then looking at the pharmacological data, they should be able to take 2,000 milligrams without any trouble at all. That's 100 times more. But in fact, what happens is, as you raise the dose, is that the psychological presentation becomes unbearable. it becomes so strange that you fear for your sanity, in a good old Edgar Allan Poe-ish phrase, you know. It gets stranger and stranger. And, you know, I've talked to pretty naive people who have overdosed. Usually the way these overdose situations occur is people are gathering mushrooms in the wild, and they start eating them, and then they just keep eating them, and then they realize they've eaten 4 times more than the effective dose. And this is where you get into places where you don't know what to say, because if you tell people, they'll throw a net over you. But you want to say because you're so personally disturbed. This is where the flying saucers land and the rectal examinations begin, and you're told that you're the Messiah, and they, you know, it becomes quirkier and quirkier. So I think you have to, you know, I'm very admiring of people who can take very high doses, but I find it quite challenging enough in the 5 to 7 gram range. A friend of mine says of psilocybin that every time he takes it, he tries to stand more, meaning more of the vision, because it is filtering itself. It's definitely filtering itself. This is why beginners almost never have bad trips, because somebody in there looks at your clipboard and says, oh, this guy has never done this before, so lay off the rough stuff. Just, you know, bring him through the standard number. It's the people who consider themselves experienced, you know, who've done it 20, 30, 40 times, says, you know, we can take the gloves off with this guy. And you know, it always amazes me. I sometimes meet people who say, you know, I've taken mushrooms 50 times and I've never had a bad trip. And I think, you know, lucky soul. Because when it goes left, it's hard. You know, it's hard. You have to really then, you know, do not your mantras bungle is the best advice I can give you, because you need to steer back toward the mainstream. Now, maybe at this point, this is a good point at which to talk about what do you do when the going gets rough. There are 2 things, at least, that you can do that are very effective. The first is, and it's a very simple thing, but people in our culture seem to be resistant to this, is you sing. You force air into your lungs and body, and you chant. You sing anything you want, and it will radically alter the parameters. There's a certain place in psilocybin that is my bête noire, which I call the meat locker. And I don't like this place, you know, and meat locker is a mild term for it. It's more like, you know, the morgue for the homicide unit or something. Whenever I start drifting that way, I sing. And then you can navigate through it. The other thing you can do, although this is sometimes trickier, is smoke cannabis. This is what those bombers are for that you rolled in the first hour while you were waiting for it to come on. Is as soon as it begins to press in some really invasive or alarming way, just take a couple of hits of the good and chant, and then you can bring it back on track. And also talk to it. Don't be afraid to say, you know, I don't like this. Take it off me. It's too peculiar. I'm not ready for this. It says, oh, sorry, you know, back to dancing mice. Yeah.
Do different batches of mushrooms have wildly varying concentrations of psilocybin?
Well, there hasn't been a lot of work on this. Michael Buckley at Evergreen College years ago grew Stropharia cubensis by the method that's described in my book, the book I wrote with my brother. And what they discovered, see, psilocybin is 4-phosphoryloxy-N-N-dimethyltryptamine. That phosphorus group is removed as soon as it crosses the blood-brain barrier. So really, what's active is a simpler compound called psilocin. And psilocin lacks the phosphorus attachment. When I was into my extraterrestrial phase, when I was assuming that the mushroom was an extraterrestrial, either the extraterrestrial itself or something designed by some kind of an extraterrestrial, it was very interesting to me that psilocybin is, as I said, 4-phosphoryloxy NN-dimethyltryptamine. It is the only 4-substituted indole in nature. The only one. Well, if you were to search for evidence of extraterrestrial tampering with the biome of this planet, what you would look for is a unique compound occurring in one life form and no other. Here it is, folks. This phosphorus group is unique. And I've never read any description or discussion of what the evolutionary history of that, why it would appear in an organism like that and not in any other. That's just an aside, because I'm always searching for the thumbprint of the alien. There may not be an alien thumbprint, but the phosphorus group attached to psilocybin is a good candidate for it. Yeah.
Switching the subjects only slightly, the descriptions that you've given of all of these experiences, although you have said that it varies widely, there is a remarkable internal consistency of your descriptions. It's that you're entering a world that seems to have boundaries and entities that you consistently encounter again and again. And nobody I've ever spoken to, people who've taken high doses or low doses, have ever had similar experiences. Now, clearly you've talked to people who have. I'm wondering if you've ever experimented with your own experiences, like what Lily describes in programming and metaprogramming. Have you worked with different presuppositions going into this to see what the limits are?
Well, my original presupposition was to try to have no presupposition at all. And then out of that came all of these assumptions. You're right that nobody has trips exactly like mine. Although, if you question people carefully, you can begin to see how it works. For example, I described this thing this morning, the elves, the presentational thing, the high-speed motion, the gifts, all that. Well, sometimes people will take DMT and they will come back and you'll realize that it's as though there is an archetype there which has different levels in it. And if I had to say what the archetype of DMT is, it's the archetype of the circus. And one time I saw a woman come out of DMT. She was an anthropologist. She had fairly high body weight, and I could tell that she had not gotten a complete hit. Came down, we said, okay, what was it? She said, it was the saddest carnival in the world. She said the carnival was closed. All the tents had their flaps rolled down, and there were just paper cups and candy wrappers blowing in the aisles in between them, and the Ferris wheel was stopped. Well, she was just at the edge of this thing, and if you think about the archetype of the circus, it is an interesting one. First of all, you have the 3 center rings, where wild and zany activity is continuously being presented. Tiny cars keep arriving with 14 clowns in each one, and they keep climbing out, falling all over each other. But it isn't all fun and games. It has a strange, erotic content. And as a child, I think my first awareness of what I would really call eros was watching this beautiful long-haired woman in a tiny spangled costume hang by her teeth 120 feet above the center ring doing acrobatics. So you've got the clown and you've got the lady in the tiny spangled costume, and then off from the center ring you have these dark alleyways where the sideshows are. The Siamese twins and the goat boy and all the rest of it, you know. And it has a very weird vibe about it. So it can land you in any of these places. But if you try and correlate people's experiences, it seems to me that it's pretty clear that through their own life history and their own programming, nevertheless, something is trying to poke through. Now, my DMT experience seems pretty radically different from other people's, although other people don't give any account at all. I mean, it's amazing how inarticulate people are. They come down, you say, how was it? And they say, it was far out. You say, you know, you don't get out of here with that rap. You know, how was it? And you say, well, they can't give a good account. On psilocybin, I think most people experience something very much like what I describe. Huge machines, a sense of danger to the earth, apocalyptic visions, the idea that someone will come and help. And I'm pretty resistant to all the flotsam and jetsam of the New Age. I mean, I don't spend a moment worrying about the exact physical location of Atlantis or stuff like that. And I think it inflates their personal mythologies and intellectual misconceptions, but there is something trying to get through. That's why this exercise, show me what you are for yourself, is really a good one. And maybe my trips are so weird because I have always worshipped weirdness. So I can go further down that road without being alarmed while somebody else would pull back. One of the problems is that we don't have complete maps of these places. At this stage in exploring that new world, what we have essentially are the scribbled diaries of frightened explorers. And we don't know if Explorer A is talking about the same river system as Explorer B, or whether they were on opposite sides of the planet or the universe. Building a coherent picture of the psychedelic dimension would be the first challenge to a rational approach to understanding it.
Have you ever read Far Journeys by Robert Monroe?
Is that the first book? No, I read the first book, and I was puzzled by how much of it didn't seem familiar to me. Like, I remember in the first book he talks about a world that's just like this world, except the cars are 9 feet wide. That would be a very puzzling psychedelic experience, to go to that world. I knew someone who was very close to him, and I don't want to set off any lawsuits here, but I once cornered this person and said, so what about it? And he said, don't worry, you don't have to worry, this is not getting close to your bailiwick at all. Buddhism of the Mahayanas has, complex system of levels and entities, wrathful Buddhas and Dharmapalas and peaceful entities. And I think that that's pretty interesting as a phenomenological description of mind. I reject the philosophical premise of Buddhism because I think it's an unbelievably uncompromising kind of nihilism. But Buddhism, as it's pitched in America, soft pedals that a lot. They don't present it as a form of nihilism, but I think ultimately it is, in the most positive sense. But still, I'm of the school that follows Alfred North Whitehead, who said, say what you may, there are certain stubborn facts. And, that's not a very Buddhist point of view. Yeah.
I don't know how far you want to go with all this, but I'm really interested in how you compare mescaline and LSD experiences with the other drugs that you talked about.
Okay, well, LSD, again, you remember, I'm only speaking for myself because there is no other way to approach it. I found LSD very interesting, but ultimately kind of frustrating because I wanted visions. And to me, what LSD by itself does is it does a lot of slippery and hard-to-name stuff. It accelerates and changes the quality of thought. But I had been reading Aldous Huxley and Havelock Ellis and those people, and I kept saying, where are the ruins of alien civilizations? Where are the jeweled tapestries? And then, fiddling around with LSD, I discovered that if I would take it with mescaline, then it became the psychedelic experience that I was seeking. But in and of itself, it's kind of psychoanalytic. It's sort of like cleaning up your act. It often focuses you on your own personal stuff. And, I have to confess to you, I'm not that interested in my own personal stuff, probably because it's so horrendous. But I don't like personalized trips. I like cosmic vision information trips. And then mescaline, you have to take a lot to get it to really do what you want it to do. And it being an amphetamine has not a very good LD50 profile. It's not like MDMA where 10 times the effective dose and you're in real trouble, but probably 40 times the effective dose and you'd be sweating bullets. So, and then just the nature of my life, I've not had as much to do with mescaline as these other things. I'm really a vision freak. And people say, well, there's feeling and there's insight and there's this and that. But the reason I'm so fixated on vision, or the excuse I give, somebody said it's because you're a double Scorpio. But to me, it's the proof that it's not coming from me. I can come up with insights. I can come up with funny ideas. But I can't come up with objects never before seen by the human eye or mind. And so when the visions start, then I feel this is the transpersonal part of the trip. This isn't my unconscious, my memories, my fears, my hopes. This is something else. Yeah.
Last night you were talking about boundary dissolution and ego reduction. In what you described this morning, how do they relate?
Well, I think in very practical terms, they show you that everything you know is wrong. How can the ego survive that piece of information? It just puts in your lap incontrovertible evidence that everything you ever thought or believed is hokum. And that's extraordinarily humbling. And that word, humbling, means the feeling you have when your ego is reduced. Humble yourself enough and you'll begin to feel humiliated. And, that's a deeper ego reduction. I think aside from any magical chemical effect they might have on ego, they're just simply showing you the true size of the universe and your place in it. And, in our down personal lives, every man, every woman, a king or a queen, we build castles in the air. Our career, our children, our whatever. Well, then you get into those places. You just say, how preposterous.
This is a dangerous kind of question, I think, maybe, but is there any gender difference in the experience?
For men and women? Well, I think women, by virtue of the fact that they menstruate and give birth, are just inherently more chemically driven creatures than men. Men are Apollonian in intent. The idea is always some kind of abstract purity, clarity kind of thing. And women know from the get-go that that's an illusion, that the reality is the floor of the rainforest, the interconnected tissue, the levels, the trade-offs, and so forth and so on. This is why I think generally men tend to be more interested in these things than women, and to also be more impacted by them. For women, it seems to sort of fit in and affirm what they knew. For men, it seems to come as a tremendous surprise that this is the way things are put together. I think that if everybody gave birth and experienced menstruation, probably we never would have launched ourselves into history. In a way, without going too far with it, men are the ancillary sex. I mean, the original blastula in the embryonic development is female. And I was listening to somebody the other night talk about this, saying no wonder men have the problems they have. What a man is a woman who has been under incredible chemical assault for 9 months in the womb. And you just have been hammered, sculpted, shaped, and recast again and again, and then you're born male. A female fetus doesn't experience anything like that. It starts out with a smooth shot, its end phylogenetic expression, and then achieves it. I don't think of the ego as particularly male, because I think we all have it to excessive degrees, but men are able to express it. A woman with an ego is frustrated. A man with an ego is a menace to all concerned, So, yeah.
How do you feel about taking a trip with another or other people? Do you think the clashing of energy and personalities changes your trip?
I think it's a very major decision to do that if you're going to take a high dose of psychedelics with somebody else, then you better be prepared to get all entangled with them, which can be great. It can also be fairly confusing. I don't like taking psychedelics. This is not an issue of entanglement. That's sort of what goes on between lovers or close friends. But I get a lot of requests to sit for people. And I don't do it because I don't know whether it's my personality or what it is, but I am unable to contain my anxiety in the presence of another stoned person, especially if I'm stoned. If I'm stoned and they're stoned and we're in a dark room, I cannot get off. I listen to them breathe. I worry. I wonder if I should ask them if they're all right. Then I go off on long trips about not interrupting them. And then that loops back into, but I haven't heard them breathe for 20 minutes. And I'm always afraid. I don't know. So really, people say, doesn't it take courage to do it alone? For me, it takes more courage to do it with people, because inevitably then you get tangled up into some kind of craziness. And, you can think you're having a telepathic experience, and they've decided that they want to have sex or something, and meanwhile, I've just had a revelation about that entry Molière made in his diary when he was talking to his niece Agnes about the nature of the French comic theater. And so you say, boy, we've got too much on the menu here. But I'm weird. Remember that, yeah.
Okay, now, and we have heard about the common visions shared by people taking ayahuasca.
You mean the group mind on ayahuasca?
Yes.
It's very possible. I mean, you can sit with someone and play a little game where you will describe the hallucinations for 30 seconds, then they get to describe the hallucinations for 30 seconds. And you can absolutely convince yourself that people are seeing the same, that you're seeing the same thing. And, when you toss sex into the mix. It just goes over the top. I mean, I've had the impression, I don't want to trot it out as a position of mine or something that I assert as true, but I have had the impression, stoned on mushrooms, making love, that it's like perspiration forms on the surface of the skin, and there's some kind of electrolytic thing that goes on, and the boundaries dissolve between the people. I don't mean metaphorically. I mean that you become one organism, and that's pretty amazing. Now, after I just said I don't like taking psychedelics with people, I guess what I should have said is I hate being responsible, because I don't mind taking ayahuasca with 30 people, none of whom speak English, in a hut up some river. But that's because I know that the old shamans are in charge, that I'm just a face in the crowd. Nobody's going to turn to me for explanation or help. I'll tell you an ayahuasca story just to give you an idea of the kind of stuff that goes on in these sessions. Years ago, in '76, Kat and I, it was before we were married, were in Peru, and we had found this shaman who was very good, and he had a following, and we were, apprenticing ourselves to him. And the style of these Peruvian mestizo people is that, cultures handle this differently, but they are never straight with each other. It's an incredibly masked culture, almost like the Japanese, but without the formality. In other words, if you think somebody's a jerk, you would never say that. That's the last thing you would say, because that's your true opinion. So we got into a situation with these people where this elder shaman, who was very respected, beloved even by these people, he had a nephew, a sobrino, who was an absolute jerk. This guy was into pimping a little on the side, and he was very ambitious to perfect his ayahuasca so he could go to Lima and charge yuppies a bunch of money for taking it and so forth. And he had this really awful habit, and I don't know what had gone on before we got there, but they would all get together to take ayahuasca. And these old guys, 80, 85 years old, the totally authentic dudes, would sing these beautiful ayahuasca songs. And he would sing against them. Can you imagine a scene like this where everybody's singing "Row, row, row your boat," except one guy wants to sing "5'2", Eyes of Blue," and does. And the level of social tension in these meetings would just rise and rise, but nobody would ever say anything to this guy and tell him to bug out and can that crap. So one night, this had happened 2 meetings in a row. It was the 3rd meeting like this. Everybody hoped this guy wouldn't come. So then he showed up. So then we all dose. Then we get loaded. And the singing begins. And he begins his singing. And in the wave of hallucinations, and Kat was sitting next to me, he was sitting up on his haunches, kind of rocking back and forth on his heels. And I would look at him, and I could see he was going through these weird animal transformations. First he would become like a jackal. Then he would become like a monkey. And it was really intense. And I mentioned it to Kat, and she could see it too. Well, so then he kept, and we were also trying to tape these ayahuasca songs. So it was a double irritation to us that this guy was so out of control. So after a particularly long song by the old guys, with him just hammering against them, I could feel Kat, who has a real Irish temper, getting more and more pissed off at this guy. And finally, at the end of this song, when the silence fell, she had been just staring at the floor, and she looked across the room at Don Jose and gave him a look of pure loathing. And I saw these red things these red triangular shaped things come out of her eyes and go across the room like and when it got to him, it knocked him off his feet. He was thrown backwards from the impact of these things, literally, and everything going on in the room stopped dead. And the elder shaman said to the guy sitting next to him, he said, "Oh, the gringa sends the ba-da-da-da-da." And, you know, then you realize, wow, we're in over our heads here. You can't tell shit from shinola in this scene. So that's an example of, you know, magical power condensed onto the material plane. Yeah.
That's an inevitable question. Did the man do his counter singing after that?
He actually didn't come back after that evening.
Then the other question, or actually a perspective, is that power and that transmission of mind so many times is carried from that energy that goes back and forth through the eyes. And I wondered if you had any more thoughts on that.
Well, it seems to imply that we are all potentially linked together in many ways that civilization has suppressed. We are no longer telepathic. We are no longer able to reach out and tap somebody with a glance like that. But I
think we do, and I think we do all the time.
But somehow our perception of what's been going on is skewed. We don't, you know, Rupert and I talked a lot about this. He had the idea that, he said, you know, the search for proof of psychic power has not been a very happy story with card flipping and this sort of thing. And Rupert had the genius to realize that what is the commonest psychic power that we all believe exists and have experienced and so forth, but which science is utterly unable to explain, that could be statistically studied. Well, what it is the sense that someone is looking at you. You know, and you could test this, and in fact we did tests where you would choose one person and put them at the front of a room full of people, and then you would tell people either look at your lap or look at the back of this person's head, and they would be asked, are people looking at you or are people looking at their lap? And certain people, you could quickly satisfy yourself, were able to detect this a phenomenal amount of the time, well beyond statistical, the rules of probability. So I think we're surrounded by subliminal abilities that we can't really understand. I mean, from years of traveling in Asia, I have an amazing psychic power, which is I can tell when food shouldn't be eaten, you know, and it will happen to me, you know, in very good restaurants, and if I go against it, you know, I'll spend the evening over the toilet because I couldn't believe that Shay so-and-so would serve poisoned food because it was costing me so much money. But then when I get back to the hotel room, sure enough, by overriding my own instincts, I get into trouble. I think psychic ability, well, this is worth talking about, that we cannot be, or how can I put it, we cannot evolve beyond the confines of our language. And if you have a language that makes telepathy impossible, then telepathy will be impossible inside that culture. You see, we all pay lip service to the idea that language and culture create each other, but we actually act as though culture is real, and it isn't. I learned this, you know, in Peru very dramatically, because in the Peruvian Amazon there's a disease which people are very, very concerned about called susto. Have all of you heard of this? Susto only affects Peruvians. This is the first clue that something weird is going on. And its major manifestation is bad luck. But if you get it, and you're a Peruvian, you prepare to cash in your chips. You know, it's as horrible as melanoma. You know, you're doomed if you have this stuff. And you have to go to a shaman and get it taken care of, or you're dead within 6 months. But I can't get susto. It's a linguistic disease of some sort. It travels around inside the confines of mestizo Spanish and nowhere else.
But it's the evil eye, isn't it also? Is the equation in the deep south of our country.
Well, yeah, people have these ideas, yeah. And, you know, like people say, well, magic is accomplished because the person the magic is being done to knows that it's happening, and therefore they unconsciously participate in their own demise. But I've observed these shamans in the Amazon, and they will go, if a shaman has decided to actually get somebody, then he will go to incredible lengths to conceal what he's doing, so that the person never knows and never knows how to blame. So it isn't some kind of psychological co-option that's happening. It's something a good deal more complex than that. Yeah.
Our culture then is very science-oriented. And the whole idea of magic, things like the existence of elves, finned horn, people laugh at that unless they're on the supposed fringes. Do you think that this kind of thing could come back? Do you think that we will have, right before our eyes, for example, experiences with these kind of things?
Yes, sure, because what you have to do is you have to shift the locus. I mean, it's kind of hard to explain, but every civilization has a locus. And we have disempowered ourselves by shifting the locus to an imagined class of experts. We have an incredibly peculiar version of how the universe is put together. First of all, we rely a lot of the time on the notion of the eensy-beensy. Genes, viruses, atoms, elementary particles. These are the things which shape our world. We tell each other. And yet, who has ever seen any of these things? I mean, a virus, maybe a few people have seen. A hydrogen atom, it's a pretty airy-fairy concept. And when you start talking about the anti-mu meson and stuff like that, where you can only approach it through an arcane mathematical language, the reality, whatever that means, of these things becomes pretty questionable. See, one of the things I think that psychedelics could do is give back to us what I call the immediacy of felt experience. Since the rise of Cartesian analysis in the 17th century, everything that we experience has been defined as what are called secondary characteristics. Color, a secondary characteristic. Feeling, and what's real is mass, momentum, charge, spin, stuff like this, which, these are the primary qualities of the universe. Whoever encounters or deals with them. We need to model reality so that it is understandable to us. I mean, that statement should even have to be made shows how far off track we are. Our current model of reality is excellent for describing the behavior of hydrogen at the center of stars or something like that. Terrible for explaining to you how you're supposed to stay tuned to your girlfriend. So somehow we have sold out to abstraction. And this is something about science, and the demonic power of numerical analysis and stuff like this. I think that part of what the psychedelic revolution is and why it is so politically threatening is because a psychedelic person does not believe anything they cannot confirm for themselves through thought, intuition, or feeling. And a non-psychedelic person joins up with the quantum physicists or the Hasidic Jews or some group of people who've already got it packaged and figured out. I mean, the UFO thing is a good example. Everybody's interested in UFOs and, you know, are there space people, are there not? And I think most people think that the news will come, that the way you encounter a UFO, the way most of us will encounter a UFO, is that the president will call a press conference and say, you know, that the time has come to speak frankly about certain declassified material, and that yes, in fact, it has been going on. I mean, that's not how it's going to happen. The way it's going to happen is on 5 grams in silent darkness in your living room, and that's real. You know, if flying saucers were to land on the south lawn of the White House tomorrow, it would be minor news compared to what can happen to you a minute and a half after smoking DMT. We don't realize that we are not real unless we are the center of our own private mandala. And so we look to media, to experts. You know, maybe the Dalai Lama can clarify it, or Mother Teresa, or Stephen Hawking. Well, forget all that. Those are just linguistic concepts as far as you're concerned. The only thing that's real to you is yourself and your immediate surroundings. And if we could empower that, you know, our political problems would disappear overnight. We are infantile and we do love it. We don't really try to claim our existential validity. And those who do are called mad because they depart from the sanctioned paradigm. I mean, one of the most satisfying experiences that I have as a public speaker is sometimes after speaking to groups like last night, somebody will come up afterward and say, I thought I was crazy until I heard you speak. Now I know there are at least 2 of us. And the truth is, you know, there are more than 2 of us. There are thousands. If you, you know, it's a delusion if it happens to one person. It's a cult if it happens to 20 people. And it's true if it happens to 10,000 people. Well, this is a strange way to have epistemological authenticity conferred upon something. We vote on it, you know. I would like competition. I mean, I feel pretty lonely out here. I'm surprised nobody has followed me into this. There must be other people who can articulate these things as well or better than I can. But boy, they don't seem to come forth. And I really don't know why that is, because what I say is not all that exceptional. It's just the sum total of it is kind of eerie. That's why I was saying, you know, we cannot evolve faster than we evolve our language. Our language is like the collective skin of our culture. So, you know, until you say the words self-transforming elf machines from hyperspace, then there aren't such things. Once you say it, it has gained a certain kind of ontological currency.
But weren't you arguing the opposite point, you know, when you spoke about, you know, becoming a quantum physicist or a Hasidic Jew?
See, people are buying other people's experience. I mean, if you're not a quantum physicist, why in the world should you take those people seriously? They're talking gibberish. What power does it have over you, except that it comes presented on the platter of science? Say, you must believe this. If you don't believe this, you're not a well-educated, trendy, with-it person. We can just say, well, malarkey. Didn't you people believe something completely different 15 years ago? You say, yes, but now we've got it. Say, well, am I supposed to take that assertion seriously? You change your mind every 6 months. I mean, surely only the most naive of quantum physicists believe that the quantum electrodynamic description of the electron is all there is to say about the electron, because biology is made out of electrons, and you can't reason from quantum electrodynamics to the rainforest. Obviously, other factors are present which are escaping this particular linguistic model. So being able to talk about something doesn't rob it of its mystery. It merely is a sectioning through it that gives you a kind of a lower dimensional map of it. But the mystery remains intact. Wittgenstein talks about what he called the unspeakable. And, the unspeakable is the true domain of being. And then within that, there is a very small subset of those things which can actually be captured in language. But they're a vanishingly small set of the whole thing. Mostly it's all mystery. I don't know why this is so surprising to people. I mean, where is it writ large that bipedal primates with binocular vision are supposed to be carrying around in their heads true models of the cosmos? I mean, would you expect an apple tree or a monarch butterfly to have a true map of the cosmos inside them? No more than that we should have. So I think all knowledge is provisional. And I think the new science will honor this. This is why the rise in the use of the word model. They no longer believe they're giving a complete explanation of phenomenon. They just say, well, here's a model, and next year we'll get a better model, and we'll keep modeling, and our models will get better and better. But they will never be more than crude approximations to an unspeakable mystery.
Do you find that tragic?
No, I find it exhilarating. I think part of the male or part of the ego dominator pathology is to demand closure out of everything. There is no closure. You have to learn to sit with the messiness of the mystery. It's this thing we said this morning. The bigger you build the bonfire of understanding, the more darkness is revealed to your startled eye. So, no, I think it's open-ended and exhilarating and tremendously exciting that that's the kind of universe we're living in. This is not merely the stoned ravings of the psilocybin brigade. Do you all know, or have you ever heard of Gödel's incommensurability theorem? This sounds daunting and disturbing. Have you ever heard of this? Does anybody have a clue what I'm talking about? Okay, well, that in itself is a measure of the kind of society we're living in, because to my mind, more important than Einstein or Schrödinger or any of those people was Kurt Gödel, German mathematician. And he began by studying the calculus, and he had a very funny method. What he did was he would number every operation in a partial differential equation. And these numbers are called Gödel numbers. G-O-umlaut-D-E-L, Kurt Gödel. And what he showed, and I think this is maybe the most important intellectual step taken in the 20th century, he showed that any formal system will produce true statements which are not provable within the confines of the formal system itself. Now, what this actually means is that mathematics can fail. It means that there is no closure. He proved this logically, showed that closure is impossible, that everything, he showed it for arithmetic, the most secure of all intellectual edifices. Essentially what he showed was that 2 + 2 = 4 is a very strong tendency, not a law. And this incommensurability theorem means that no program of formal analysis will ever completely exhaust its subject. There will always be a residuum of mystery. And we need to come to terms with this. I mean, it's taken us 80 years to get Einstein under our belts. And that's a simple notion compared to what Gödel is saying, because what he's saying is not about, the distortion of space-time near massive objects, but something which actually affects our own lives on a day-to-day basis. And, if you live for closure, you're beating your head against a stone wall, and your head will wear out long before the stone wall will. There's a kind of an appreciation for the mystery needs to replace the attitude that the mystery is an unsolved problem. Mysteries have no relationship whatsoever to unsolved problems.